And hey everybody, thank you for tuning in. And today I'm really excited to talk with Mr. Thomas Campidell. Thomas is currently working as a research fellow at the Bayesian bodybuilding team. We have known each other now for a while, and we had the chance to meet at a conference in Amsterdam before. And Thomas has done a lot of interesting research on different psychological concepts such as behavior change and the like, but we're going to get into all of these things. Thomas is also coaching people and is going to produce more and more content in the near future, has his own website. Thomas, did I miss anything important, trivia?
That sounds about right, yeah. I think you covered the most essential things, yeah.
Awesome. So I'm really excited to talk to you because we are going to be talking about a topic that I wanted to have guests on for a long time to talk about, and that is behavior change and this kind of just the differences between people when it comes to personality traits and even subtle things that we don't normally think of. That's a really cool topic that I think a lot of people could benefit from learning about. So I guess my first question to you, and then we can dig deeper from there on. But what I want to ask you first is, based on your research and based on the things that you read about, like, what do we currently know about personality traits and how people differ in them? Like, how much is it nature and how much of it is nurture? Because that's kind of the age-old debate, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and that there's been lots of research in various areas of psychology. And well, the most interesting studies in this regard would be twin studies, right? So you look at two twins, and you see sort of they have the same genetics in essence, and you put them in different life situations, different environmental surroundings, right? Different schools, different parents, different influences, different social circles, and then you see how similar do these people develop. And from there you can make statistical models that tell you that it's about 50-50. So how fixed is your personality? It's about 50% is fixed and 50% is sort of, how should I say, is changeable or formable, or you can do something about it. So I'd say that.
Right. Okay, so where should we, probably we should dig into this a little bit further. So when we are talking about something that is fixed versus changeable, like how would this, I don't know, like just so people can kind of conceptualize it, how would this look like in practice? So how much can a person kind of transform him or herself in a sense, if this question is not too vague?
No, that's fine. Practical example. For example, we know that top managers, like the top leadership people, have very high conscientiousness levels, right? So this is a behavioral trait that is fairly fixed throughout your lifetime. And it just means how well you're organized, how well you can execute the things that you set out to do, how well you, in general, are just efficient with all the things you set out to do. And we see there is a very common thread along or in the top fields, right? The top managers, the top leaders. And what I will say is that when some trait, like in psychology, we always say like a personality trait, what does it mean, right? It's a personality trait is, the translation would be, it is a tendency to show certain behavior. So it means it's not like you're a conscientious person, so you're conscientious in every situation, right? It just means that you tend to be very organized and you tend to be very systematic more often than not. So obviously, since people are very, they learn by modeling others, right? So a child learns by modeling their mother and their close, or its close relatives. So we can, like by making a big environmental change, our personality sort of traits can develop further or being sort of dampened, right? So someone who is a very conscientious person, probably if they have never the opportunities, right, it's the environmental opportunities to foster this, they will never develop or make a career out of it or have like the social, just the social setup for this. right? So it's always, personality is always like our strong tendencies, but it's never like fixed. You can never say that every leader is super conscientious. Like there is a big trend, but I'm sure there are exceptions, right? The environment plays a big role too.
Yeah, and okay, so this is a great lead, because this is something that I personally just always found really fascinating. That, for example, when I was in uni and they put us in different group settings, and we had to work together as a group on some assignment, and it was so clear within 10 seconds, like what kind of roles formed, like which were the people who were the bossy types, which were the ones who were kind of sitting in the background. So, I mean, that kind of always made me think that there must be some sort of wiring. But at the same time, I always wondered, like, how much is this just training throughout their childhood? So, in your opinion, like when we're talking about these genetic or very much just traits that are not kind of shaped by conscious training, like, do you think it's something that you're born with, or is it just something that have been developed at a very, very young age?
It can be both, right? So as I mentioned before, some traits like can be developed. Like you can be, I don't know, an assertive person. For example, like I could be a naturally assertive person in a group setting, and this has always come to me naturally. As a child, I always wanted to be like the first one to be picked, and at sports class or something, I always like, for example, if I'm assertive, I always said my opinion openly, and I'm very like extroverted. But the thing is this, like, even though as an adult, for example, you are maybe naturally introverted or not as assertive, if you train yourself to show the behavior, like if you actually consciously want to be more assertive, it might feel like if you try this out, then you're in a group and you try to be more assertive, it sort of might never feel as natural, like as if it belonged to you. You know, this behavioral aspect belonged to you. But you can actually still, you know, give a talk, be assertive, and people will believe you in most of the cases, right? So people just generally see the overt behavior that you show. So if you act as if you were confident and assertive, in general, people will be likely to believe you, sort of. And in that case, like, for example, some people might be bad public speakers because they lack natural assertiveness or extroversion, but they can develop this so that they, let's say in their usual life, they are very introverted and are not very social. But as soon as they get on a stage, right, or talk about topics that they are very passionate about, they have trained themselves to sort of tap into a different personality matrix, right? So into a different personality trait group, I'd say. Yeah. So it is definitely trainable, in my opinion, to a large part.
Yeah. Okay. So I finally understood what you meant. That you might have personality traits that just never you just never been able to express them. So you might be under the impression that you have a certain personality trait, whereas in reality it's just maybe the environment suppressed it. Like one funny example that comes to mind is, like, I can think back of several times in my life where I just found myself in some really cool social setting or social group, and compared to myself, I was very outgoing, very talkative, very loud, but still people just out of the blue started referring to me as, you know, quiet or shy or whatever. And probably because, like, with subtle things, I still gave it away that I'm more of an introverted person. But compared to myself, I was really crazy extroverted. So that's very interesting. Yeah. So the next thing I want to delve into, which is more of a kind of a specific topic, or no, like just one other thing I want to touch on, is that if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, some people might get to the level that other people are with, like, conscious training. So as you said, maybe I'm a bad public speaker, but I'm training myself to get better at it. I may get to the point where, to the outside viewer, I'm just as good as someone who's been just a natural talker throughout all his life. but what I'm feeling internally, there's still that added level of like deliberate element to it that the other person doesn't have, because for him or her it comes completely naturally. So first, like big topic I want to cover with you, and we'll see how long it will actually take, is that there's this age-old saying, of course, that, I may not have as much talent as you, I may not be, as gifted, but I can work so much harder than you are. But is hard work and is being motivated and driven, is that also a talent in a way? What's the deal there, in your opinion?
Yeah, so being motivated is very broad, right? You can also be motivated to do drugs. So it's in general, like if we talk about hard work, what we classify nowadays as hard work, meaning being able to sit long hours at one task, right? So being very organized. This is actually what I talked about before. Those are a lot of behaviors that would fall under the trait of conscientiousness. So you could argue that hard work is a behavioral trend, right? It's a personality trait. But what I would say is that depending on, as we talked before about opportunities, right? So let's say one person is not a natural hard worker and never seems to be, doing anything for much longer than a month. But then as soon as they find they go into a different country, they meet a new person, right? Then certain sort of latent capabilities that they had covered under the surface can come up, right? They can, for example, they meet a new person, then they suddenly motivated to do sports, right? It happens to a lot of people. So they get into fitness, right? We talk about fitness, and they make a complete makeover from completely lazy person to a disciplined and engaged and conscientious person. So for some people, I think there is a lot of possibility for big triggers, right? It might even be a negative event. Let's say for some people, their close relative dies and they suddenly get a sort of personality growth out of that, right? So there's a lot of research on war veterans, right? On post-traumatic growth, which is called. And that's a very interesting topic, that people can make these crazy shifts even though they have lived their life in a certain way. And I find that fascinating. And is there something you want to touch specifically on?
Yeah, like one thing I find very, very interesting is that like some people are, it almost seems like they have this sense of urgency at all times, which other people don't have. Because I think objectively, all people know more or less what they should do. So, I think, for example, a person who wastes an entire afternoon doing nothing, just, laying on the couch and watching TV, I don't think that person objectively thinks that that's the right thing to do. Like most probably that person also knows that he could spend his time much more productively. But then there is another person for whom it just comes completely like automatically as a compulsion to do kind of quote unquote the right thing. And like and for other people it seems to come more in waves. Like maybe they have an epiphany at one moment that like fuck, like I'm wasting so much time, I should be more productive. So like I don't know, like what do you think about this? Like why is this sense of urgency with some people?
Well, this sense of urgency is, I would translate that into a feeling of intrinsic motivation. So they are very motivated to just do it without any specific reason. They just feel like they have to do it, right? It's automatic, what you said. And where can we start? Since we talked about different personality traits, there is also a big difference in, for example, psychologically, how people, what the mood of a person is, right? So some people fluctuate a lot in their mood. They get deep winter depression state, sort of where they're unmotivated to do anything. They hardly get out of bed for a couple of weeks or months even. And then over the summer, they get more and more sort of enthusiastic about projects. And this is something that differs from person to person. Some people are more stable and some people are more sort of emotionally bouncy and reactive. In general, for example, women tend to be on the bouncier side compared to men, which are generally more stable. But obviously, like, just because there are gender differences doesn't mean there are interpersonal differences in general. So that's one big part, like this sort of like stable mood. But then also, if we sort of engage in behavior, and it is very, how should I say, it is very rewarding at the beginning, it might get such a deep, like what, in my opinion, what people call intrinsic motivation is very fascinating, because it actually refers to a feeling of being self-efficacious, right? So of self-efficiency, in my opinion. So let's say, for example, somebody gets really, really good, like starts out to play basketball and struggles at the beginning, but keeps at it and works hard at it because he just feels like he needs to, nail a few more shots or a few techniques until he gets good. And then he reaches a point where he is at a level where he feels like he can really change something, right? He feels like he is he's actively causing a difference in the world, right? Such a feeling of causality is actually what children crave from the first day that they are born. For example, a baby crying and getting attention is sort of a reinforcement of just being efficacious in the world, as weird as that sounds, right? So, for example, a child banging his hand on the table just because it makes a cool sound is actually exciting for the child, because it knows, oh, I can actually do stuff in this world. And this is a very, very big part for psychological health, is that you have the feeling that you actually, if you put your mind to something, if you decide to do something, that it has an effect in the world. And a lot of this can be screwed up in your in your upbringing. Your parents never let you do stuff by yourself and never reinforce if you did something yourself, like you did something creatively, and always, just just follow us and do it like we do it. Then this gets sort of buried, right? This feeling of self-efficacy. And this is, in my opinion, a large part of intrinsic motivation. So because we talked about, actually, you can, I'll let you say.
Yeah. It just made me think, So you're saying that with our education, we can screw this process up, and so because I always thought of self-efficacy as a feeling of, you can basically a self-belief, like a belief that you can solve things, and if you decide on something, then you will actually follow through. It's basically a belief in your own decisions. That's how I always thought of self-efficacy. Is that the wrong way to think about it?
No, that's about right. That's about right. So the belief that you can achieve something with your efforts,
right,
is the broad definition.
So could it be that, or maybe let's put a more positive spin on it. So let's try to give something actionable. So if someone is in kind of this spiral of, they just can't really get anything done. They decide on things, but then they screw up. First of all, let's identify the problem. Like, what is likely to be going on here? Is it just it could be just a lack of strategy. It could be just not being prepared for what you actually want to do. But then it could also be this kind of like a mental blockage that takes place. Like, you don't really believe that you can do it, or what do you think?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Like, if you ask the type of guy that always starts something that never actually follows through, yeah, I'd say, for one, there can be a big, as we talked about, a big sort of, from his personality, there's not as much conscientiousness or as much of a natural sort of aroused. They're not as aroused of a type as others, but obviously it can also be the case that, for example, with lots of eating disorders, I see this because we talk a lot about eating disorders in psychology also, is that people actually are running away from something. So they're not as cliche as it sounds, like following their heart, following what their tendencies tell them to do, and where they're good at, and where they see that they can excel. But actually, they're just fleeing from something that they are not willing to deal with. For example, a relative dies, or some other bad thing happens. And then, for people to gain a sense of control, they just don't eat. Right? They just find a way to control something, so that they get this feeling of control, of being efficacious back, right? To bring it back to self-efficacy. So that feeling of control, I think, plays a big part. Like, if you say, why can't you follow through with something? It could also be that the person has like a big tolerance for ambiguity. Some people have like the high risk takers. They're just mentally so stable that they're fine with putting all their money on the table just to double it up. And if they lose it, I don't care. Like, I'll risk it. And for some people, no, they just can't handle the stress, right, that this would cause them. So there are large differences in how much how much ambiguity we tolerate in our work life, in our social life, with our relationships, whether we create a more stable relationship, for example, or a more affair-based multitude of girls. So obviously you can always go through phases, but I'd say that's a big one, like tolerating ambiguity, and that coupled with certain personality traits and your drive, like your natural arousal levels, if you're an energetic person or if you tend to fluctuate more, all that I think plays a role here. So, but it's obviously a very hard thing to answer.
Right.
Shortly.
No, that is actually a very good point. Like, if I'm thinking about the stuff that I tend to procrastinate on, they're all things where it's not a clear-cut action step series that I need to complete. It's something that,
exactly.
Okay, I do that, but what is going to happen after
It's
that? Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about, since we talked a lot about motivation. We talked about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. What do you think is the when I don't know how it was now you're part of the Bayesian team, but one thing that really was memorable for me when I was taking the Bayesian PT course is this concept of enthusiasm versus motivation. And then I actually thought about that. Okay, enthusiasm is probably when you're really fired up after like watching some inspirational movie or motivational video or something like this, and motivation is kind of the long-term fuel that sustains you over the long term and makes you do the right things. So how do you view the difference between these two things, enthusiasm and motivation?
I'd say that enthusiasm, like to define it more narrowly, is just an extraordinary, like euphoric type mood state, right? A big spike in your emotions. And obviously a big spike in emotions can have like the tendency to for you to engage in a certain behavior, right? That triggered sort of this enthusiastic type of feeling, right? So it's a big short-term motivator. So the definition of motivation then would be, in general, what is motivation? Motivation is the reason why we engage in the behavior. So that could be short-term, that could be long-term, that could be lifetime. And there is always a multitude of reasons why we engage in behavior. And I would say that, as we talked about earlier, the example that a big emotional spike, be it negative or positive, like someone dying or someone celebrating something or some other big event that happens, might give the person such a big push in a direction that they engage like in a certain behavior in work, in training, in healthy eating habits, for example, that the results that they then see, like by this extrinsically motivated enthusiasm that push them into there, or for example, getting fit for girls or getting fit to have like a six-pack on the beach, which is actually very extrinsic and has nothing to do with deeper values. But it can like motivate you to pursue the behavior that you do to get the six-pack in a more intrinsic way. So there can be like a mixture, right, at the beginning of extrinsic and its intrinsic motivation. So you actually might enjoy like going every day to the gym, even though it's painful. You feel like you're working on yourself. You feel it just makes sense in your view of the world. So that's a big part, that everybody has a model of the world, and at certain stages in their life, depending on their circumstances and personality, as we talked about, certain things can make more sense and can be more rewarding and reinforcing, and that other times they might be completely ignored, right? So if another priority comes up for a year, boom, the behavior is gone. But then, like as soon as the situation stabilizes, the behavior comes back because it now fits again. So that's what I would say about enthusiasm and long-term motivation.
It's interesting because when you look at certain people like Gary Vaynerchuk and some of these influencer type Tonny Robbins, like they're always super energetic, super fired up. It almost seems like they are in this constant state of enthusiasm. Like it seems like it's more than just motivation. It's like they wake up every day super energetic and super high energy. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely though a big point. Like that, for example, like these are complete outliers, right? These are like Gary Vaynerchuk's and Tony Robbins. Obviously, there is a big bias because we only see them on social media, so that could be biased towards like that they're actually more energetic than when they wake up and go through their everyday. But definitely, like there are big differences in how energetic, which would be your base levels of arousal that you have, right? But the thing is this, like being aroused is not the only ingredient, like being high energy, because if you are high energy, but your wiring is such that your high energy actually makes you paranoid, right? Your overactivation is not experienced as a positive mood state, but it is experienced as a negative. Like, for example, with your neurotransmitters, if your dopamine gets too high, that could trigger hallucinations, right? Like amphetamines, for example, do. And so it cannot be generalized. It needs to be a big, for someone like Tony Robbins, I think you need to have a certain cocktail of neurotransmitters and of your biology in general, so that you could display something like that guy does. So that's definitely a big part of him is personality fixed based, like with
Yeah. So basically, the message is that they are either not always like this because we just see the highlight reel, or if they are always like this and they're always that high energy, then they are outliers, and that's just the reality.
It's basically very, very healthy people. So they're like for them, it's very easy to think positively and to, as we talked, like tolerate risks and being very extroverted, being very comfortable talking to lots of people. Being very dominant. Dominance is a very big trait there. So. Yeah, definitely.
All right. So if we want to take something like dieting as an example, which involves a lot of self-restriction, it's not always fun. You have to say no to things that you would otherwise do. So it requires some constant degree of self-discipline. And if people want to have a sense of urgency at all times, or they want to feel motivated to be on track towards your goals at all times, like what would be a couple of practical strategies that you think we could recommend them to keep in mind or to try out when things get rough and they don't always feel motivated to do the right things?
Well, dieting is definitely a case where you want to have a good plan, and not only a plan, but also like a couple of tools, a couple of strategies that you can implement when things get tough, right? So when things actually don't go according to plan, something comes up, for example. So a good track record in research do implementation intentions have. So implementation intentions is simply a very complex term for simple if-then sentences that you come up with before something happens, and where you plan to do something that's very specific in that situation, right? So sounds very complicated, but it's just very simple. It means, for example, if I am very stressed after work and come home, then I will eat my prepared fruit salad. Right? So it's in that situation, like you might come home from work and you, instead of just coming up with something to eat in that moment, where you might don't have the cognitive resources to make a good decision, like in that case, you're not remembering your higher values, you're just going by feel in the moment. So then it helps, like, oh, okay, right, so stressed, I already made the connection or the strategy to eat my fruit salad. In that case, it also helps to have something prepared, obviously. So this is generally something that you want to be aware. For example, also not only when dieting, but in general, whenever you have a big project coming up, that the way you feel in the moment, like your mood, you always project onto your future and past thoughts. Right? So what this means is that we are very, very bad at predicting how we are going to feel, for example, in a week from now. So if we are in a bad mood right now, we probably think that this is going to last forever. I'm never going to get this done, and I'm just not motivated. It's not working, right? It can even go the other direction. It can go like, I'll just do this tomorrow because maybe tomorrow I'll be more motivated, right? So it's like this big bias that we have in psychology is called forecasting bias. So our mood, like we always think we can predict our mood and our motivation levels, our enthusiasm levels, I would say, very well, but it's actually very biased by the moment, by the mood that you're experiencing right now. So, for example, like if you are having almost like a headache, a mild headache from working long hours, and you come home and you think everything sucks, but then you take a cold shower and suddenly the world looks great again. So that's just an example of how the whole world can change as soon as your arousal level changes, right? You take a cold shower, which is just a big energy boost in that case. So yeah, Abel, anything else you want to touch on in that regard?
I think it's very interesting, and I think implementation intentions, those can like even go the other way around. Like, so for example, you make a promise to yourself that you will do something. So for example, you will, I don't know, go to the gym every day, or maybe that's the wrong example, because people are generally, who are listening to this are
that's too general. Yeah, they need to be specific.
Yeah. So let's say you are setting yourself a goal of whatever, a calorie target that you will hit each day when you're dieting. So let's say you will have hit 2,200 calories on a diet, and but maybe on some days you just are on your feet a lot, or some things are going on and you're just ravenously hungry. And maybe then you can set yourself like a condition in which you're allowing yourself an additional, I don't know, 300 calories or something. So I will hit 2,200 calories unless this happens or something, right?
Exactly. And it can also, that's just a very practical example, but it can, or a very immediate example, but it can also work for thought patterns that you have. Like if you find yourself to be a very worrisome person, right? So you tend to have lots of irrational worries. For example, if you go over your calories on one day, as you said, like if you catch yourself like having these overblown thoughts, like, oh, I'm going to fail my diet, and whoa, I'm just going to screw this up again. Like if you predetermine to make it a habit that every time such a thought comes up, maybe to write it down or to look over your diet journal. Like, for example, if a thought like this, XYZ, comes up, I'm going to look over my diet journal that I kept and see that actually 90 out of, 100 days, I made good progress, or I kept very on track. So in the long term, this is not going to be a big deal. So it can work for thoughts and thought patterns as well.
Yeah, and this is actually a good point, that many times many times when you're about to screw something up. So, classic example, binging on a diet or, overeating a little bit and then sliding into trouble. Of course, we can use a lot of pop psychology terms like what the hell effect and those kinds of things. But I think oftentimes it comes down to that one critical moment of either catching yourself on the way of sliding down and catching yourself when that slide is really minor, or actually letting that slide, turn into a major fall into, nothingness. So, yeah. And that actually is a what you just mentioned is a good point to bring up something else. So you mentioned looking back at your past progress, and when you have some nice momentum built up, and you can look back at past progress, that's very encouraging. And that's why people recommend keeping journals. That's why people recommend, for example, keeping a calendar and putting red X's on every day when you have accomplished your goals. But of course, getting to that point is the biggest challenge. So getting started is really tough. So when you have no past progress to look back on, and then getting started with something, dieting again is a good example. That can be very, very tough. So what can we recommend to people about just getting started and getting through that initial resistance? Because that's a big part of the game, right?
So this in general, with every habit that you try to adopt, it's obviously the first few weeks are going to be the hardest, and you actually from like neurologically, your body, it will literally be perceived for your brain as physical pain. Like, for example, doing a hard type of work or engaging in activities that you're not used to doing, it literally will feel like a threat to your brain. So you have to understand that this sort of pain period at the beginning is there. That's step one, in my opinion. And then step two, you have to make sure that you control, or that you engage in sort of a process where you can make lots of small decisions, like that you build this sort of self-efficacy that we talked about before. So, for example, like, don't take on too much. With habits, you should never take on too much, right? Because then you cannot control everything, and it goes overboard. But for example, doing very simple sort of, for example, if someone has never tracked calories, right? Just the fact that he is tracking calories now can be an empowering thing for them, so that they, for a few days, they can make a check mark that they are actually tracking calories. And then they might start tracking their protein. Then they might start even tracking their fats and carbs. And then some people track their activity. And all these kinds of things, like, don't overblow it, right? So let certain things sink in, like do them consistently for a while until they get habitual. And yeah, in general, always try to when dieting or when faced with any task, try to break it down into actionable steps where you can actively, consciously make decisions on, right? So, okay, today I did my 30,000 steps, right? You can check it off, right? Or write it down, or you have a protocol of what you're doing. You're not like a victim of the moment or how you feel in the moment, and one day is good and one day is bad, right? So you slowly build it up. Then over a couple of months, you can look back and say, whoa, it's a lot of work, or a lot of things I did in my protocol that look so big now, but actually were not that big of a deal, right? So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, and another thing, I mean, we didn't plan to talk about this. It just came to mind as a random thought, that this concept of starting small. It's I've read this book, Mini Habits. It was a cool book, and I think I'll review it at some point. But it's basically was just about this concept of people are just like unwilling to settle for small changes initially. Like, there is this inner compulsion to start really big and to overhaul everything. And of course, I mean, to use again a dieting analogy, that's kind of like setting a 1,200 calorie deficit as opposed to a 500 one, to just get the job done as quickly as possible. It's an understandable impulse. Like, everybody wants results as fast as possible. But I think, like, sometimes it's almost like a matter of self-restraint, like just accepting the reality that you're not capable of keeping up with certain things. In an ideal world, you would be, but it's a matter of accepting the fact that you're not living in this alternate, ideal universe. It's really interesting for me. I think it's fascinating.
I think what you touch upon there can be also defined as like finding the balance between self-discipline and self-acceptance or self-compassion. Right? So there are people who tend to be very self-disciplined, but never forgive themselves for anything and are very neurotic about it. And if something goes wrong, then they go completely crazy, and they never actively tell to themselves, like have the self-talk of, no, it's fine, you did all your work, you did the best you can, right? And other people, like they're just chilling each day, and they don't seem to have any self-discipline, like lots of self-acceptance, but no self-discipline, which is also something that probably in a world like ours is not going to work unless someday everything is being taken care of and we can just chill in the woods and meditate. But it's definitely some interesting concept.
Yeah. I think just like with many things, there is always a kind of a sweet spot and a balance. Like in a lot of these concepts, like for example, accepting who you are. That's a good advice until it's not. Like, yeah, sure, accept who you are, but not to the point where you're giving up on all your ambitions. For example, that's one example that comes to mind to me a lot. Next thing that we noted that we could talk about is this concept of journaling and writing down thoughts that you have or concerns that you have, identifying negative loops that you may be getting into. Like, what is your experience with this kind of thing, or what have you read about this concept or its usefulness?
Yeah, so journaling is funny because journaling has a very, very broad application, especially in all in all fields of psychology. So, for example, in cognitive behavioral therapy, where people are treated that have depression, like that are suffering from very negative thought patterns each and every day, and they cannot seem to get out of it. Or even with dieting, like as we talked about dieting, keeping a journal is so powerful that even just no matter what you actually write in your journal, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? But just the fact that you are consistently putting your thoughts into words, this process is actually something that is keeps you better on track with your diet, like keeping a log, for example, and can also be a help for really giving structure to your mental world. So that sounds a bit weird, but it's just you can view it as a tool for sort of like as a program for your computer that does that cleans the cache, right? So you're every day you go through different mood states and you accumulate lots of bullshit along with your best thoughts. There comes some bullshit thoughts and some random shit that you pick up. But then at night you run this filter, you run this program through, which is you write down, the best thoughts you had, the most bullshit thoughts you had. You just write something from what you remember from this day down. And then if you look it over, for example, the next day, you might have a completely different, you might ask yourself, like, how could I think this, or how could I write this? So it actually puts your thoughts in perspective, and you can it's almost like if you write stuff down and then read it later, it's as if you were talking to yourself, like from a whole other level, right? You're not caught up so much in the moment or how you feel in the moment, but you can really, almost as if you were talking to a friend, you could you can give him advice, or you can look over what he's doing and structure stuff just better, right? So the same goes if you have, like as we talked about before, a diet. Just being on a diet, you have to do all those different things, right? You have to track macros here, you have protein here. Just try to, write it down and make 3 or 4 big pillars, what you have to do, right? You have to think about your protein, you have to think about your calories, you have to think about, okay, after work, the situation we talked about before, what can I do there? And then you just give it structure, and then you write, 1 or 2 bullet points, how you can organize this, and then sometimes it relieves so much stress because you just put it on paper and you just externalized it and gave it structure. And so one technique that I've learned from a psychologist during my learning years was, for example, that anytime you face a difficult decision where you're not sure if you're deciding rationally because you're just very emotional in the moment, a simple technique would be to just imagine that a very close friend of yours has this problem, and what would you, in that case, advise to your friend in that situation? So this actually gives you sort of this zoomed out view, right, without the emotions. Like, oh, of course, if my friend was in a fucked up relationship, I would, of course, tell him, like, look, here, you for 3 months you were unhappy, or 4 months, this can't go on, blah, blah, blah. Right, so you have a super objective view. Whereas if you reflect about this yourself, you're always biased by yourself, right? Because everybody thinks that they're special, right? Which is kind of true, but it also distorts your thinking because, no, I'm different, so this doesn't apply to me, right? It's a very common thought. So, that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, journaling to me is really fascinating. Like, kind of the way I phrased it, I mean, kind of you phrased it the same way, but the way I think about it is just kind of like taking a mental detox in a sense. Like, I always analogize it to like taking a dump after you've been constipated for a long time. And, I think that we are kind of naturally given this opportunity when we were kids. If we were fortunate, we had parents to talk to, and we could always share our problems with them, and they could give a different viewpoint on everything that was going on for us. And even, the more fortunate people among us have friends that we can share these things with. But, let's be real, a lot of people don't. It's not necessarily that they don't have friends. Maybe they do have friends, but most friends don't give a shit about you per se. I mean, they want to have fun with you. They are happy to go out for drinks and, play soccer or whatever, but they don't want to hear about your problems. I mean, they have their own problems to think about. So I think journaling in this kind of a context is almost like the poor man's version of going to a psychologist. I mean, if you can't afford that, then just capturing your thoughts and putting them on paper is a really good way to kind of get those poisonous stuff out of your mind every once in a while, so they don't just, eat you up from the inside. And the other thing I want to touch on is that there's probably a repetition component to all of this. So that's one thing to write it down for yourself one time, like, what would I say to a friend if he or she was in the same position? But that will probably not be enough. That's a very nice affirmation one time, but you have to repeat it a sufficient amount of times to kind of create that rewiring effect.
Definitely, and as we talked about before with the journaling, it's most effective if you do it regularly, right? So it not only overt behavior, like a behavior that you can observe has the potential to become a habit, but also thinking patterns can become a habit. So, and if you can plant the seed, sort of, that you find the triggers that trigger your negative thinking, and then can plant the seed that slowly, first through self-awareness and then through practice, can reframe yourself in a more positive way, then definitely. It becomes a habit, right? It becomes a habit of thinking. And for some people it's more easy because they have the genetic makeup to, think positively. It comes easy to them. But for others it's harder, and for most it's like in between. So you always gotta do the best you can. But definitely working on yourself, or working on, not being a very big thing is not being limited by your own experience of the world. In the sense that, try to get opinion from outside and try new things, right? So if someone gives you advice, maybe just blindly trust it and try it out. Maybe you thought, no, this would never work on me, but actually you might be surprised that some stuff actually completely changes certain views that you have, right? The older you get, the more fixed your views become, and it's always good to be mentally flexible to keep yourself young also on a psychological level.
Yeah, and I just talked about this on a recent podcast, that personal development books are oftentimes not very actionable. They are full of fillers, and many times they are just not that useful. but they can be a very useful exercise in the sense that you're reading them every night before falling asleep, and you're always kind of reminding yourself of the changes that you want to make. And that can, in a sense, be a very nice repetitive exercise to create this rewiring in your brain and in your thought patterns, I guess.
Exactly. It just reinforces the person that you want to be, right? So every time that you, like, I think Aristotle said that learning, no matter what, is rewarding in itself, because it's just we're wired to learn new stuff. And like I noticed from university, if you're learning something new and then you get new insights, no matter the topic, you actually feel a sense of control, a sense of ease, a sense of well-being. I think that's why it's important to always learn something, to have hobbies where you can learn something, learn new skills, and to make your life in a way that you can, that you always try on so many new things that you can experience this a lot, this feeling of, oh, I'm learning something. Because if you're very deep in only one topic, it might be very, dragful to always, oh, there's not much new, all right, yeah. Like, for example, I delved so deep into stress psychology that I was almost like, all right, like, I'm just bored by this. It's like, it either got too complicated or it was not as rewarding as it was in the beginning. So, for example, for me, it's much more rewarding nowadays to do as a hobby, to go play snooker, for example. Like, just learn a completely new skill. I think it's one of the best things you can do. Like, that's also what people do in therapy, right? They just make people draw something, be creative, as basic as that sounds. But yeah, just always learn. And the same goes with, like, mastery, right? So I think I read this in Robert Greene's book, which is also called, like, the same title, Mastery, that no matter which master you learn from, it doesn't matter, because all mastery is simply the mastery over yourself, right? So every master in every field has learned to conquer himself or herself. So that's why you can always learn from sort of master people in every field.
Yeah, and what I want to mention about this is that if people are not sure how they can start doing this, so obviously if you're on a Sunday afternoon, you're at home with your laptop and you're just Googling around on the internet, and you could do so many things, you could learn so much stuff by Googling the right stuff. It can be, I guess, very paralyzing and confusing. People are not really sure how to get started on this. Just sign up for a lot of things. Just make yourself crazy busy. Take music lessons or sign up for appointments with people. Just basically, if you're not sure how to start, then just force this learning component into your life by just packing your schedule full of stuff that do have these learning elements. So, just make yourself busy. Don't leave this to chance, I would say.
Exactly. Like, try to trick yourself by doing something external so that it can then become an intrinsic motivation, like as we talked before, or at the beginning of the talk. Yeah, that's definitely a good strategy. Also for just set yourself deadlines, but not only deadlines that you can change on the fly, but like literally tell a friend that leverage it by, I don't know, money. You give him money and he doesn't give it back to you if you don't match the deadline. Or just do it, like, use those little tricks, which are just the most basic form of extrinsic motivation, right? You don't want to get punished. You don't want to experience a negative event, sort of, right? So it's be it negative or positive emotion, it's always a reason to engage in a behavior that you want to engage in. So I think in that case, like, it's always a good thing that you can. Like, it's just good to know that there are many types of tools you can use to motivate yourself if you're not intrinsically motivated right from the get-go.
Yeah, and a concrete example from my case is the reason I started doing this high-volume, high-frequency podcasting. Maybe I should call it Bayesian podcasting, actually.
Don't plan any deloads.
No, but the reason why I started doing it is because if you give yourself really strict deadlines, like you have to pump out an episode a day, then in a sense it makes it very unambiguous what you have to do. Like, if you have to pump out an episode a day, if you have a really close deadline, then it doesn't fucking matter what kind of productivity system you come up with. if you have managed to complete that task for that day, you had to have come up with something, some kind of schedule or productivity system that had to make sense, because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to accomplish it. So the last topic I want to touch on, because I find this to be a very fascinating topic, is acute strategies to pump yourself up or make yourself acutely enthusiastic or motivated. So strategies such as watching YouTube videos or listening to motivational soundtracks, or even using substances like caffeine. I see, it's very interesting for me because I see people succeeding on both strategies. So I do see people who use all of this stuff and just go crazy with the motivational tracks and everything. And there are other people who don't do any of this stuff. In fact, often they think that these things are just stupid, and they don't need to do any of that stuff to remain, productive and, ultimately successful. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is like one of the most individual topics, I would say, because like you have these, as you said, like you have people who always need to pump themselves up, and then you have people who find it super stupid that this guy listens to, I don't know, some rap music saying you need to hustle every day. But I think it comes down to there are different, like people have different levels of arousal that they go through the day, right? They're differently, their activation levels, their baseline, which you could call energy levels, right? Their arousal levels, like their heart rate, their sympathetic activation. Just for some people, for me, for example, it fluctuates very hard. For example, I get a big boost in the morning, and then I get a huge fall during the noon hours, where I could literally after lunch, I could literally just lay down for 3 to 4 hours and do nothing at all. And then in the evening, I'm actually very productive and feel creative again. So these would be, and for some people, like it's the opposite. Like they wake up groggy and then it goes better and better, and then in the evening it fades off again. But this differs from person to person, right? So you have to find. And it can also help, like with journaling. You write down when you have these active phases, when you're more energetic, you write it down, and then you structure. If you have the luxury to do this, you structure your most difficult tasks right around those times, because they just naturally, or it just will be easier to do it, right? If, however, that's not possible, or if you just need more arousing atmosphere or more aroused mood, then obviously you can use strategies like drinking coffee, which gets your arousal levels up, and you can listen to motivational music. You can take a cold shower. Like all of these things get you into such a different activation level bodily that your mental state follows along usually. So going for a walk or going for a run or doing 20 burpees with like motivational music or yelling, even like anything that is very expressive, or is a big shock, like showering, can change your sort of focus levels, your attention, which is also related to your mood, right? It can change your mood, and then stuff can be easier. So I would say like the two big points are find the times of the day where you're most energetic, and use caffeine and cold showers and motivational music strategically depending on your needs.
Yeah, I think you covered this point really well. And I think it's one of those things where, if these strategies help you, then why wouldn't you take advantage of them? If you're one of those people who just don't really benefit from this and you do the right things anyway, then, good for you. But if you do manage to do a lot better work each and every day by listening to some guy yelling to you to hustle, then, why wouldn't you make the most of that and enjoy the benefits of that kind of a strategy? So, yeah. Okay, Thomas, I think that we covered a lot of cool ground in this episode. So just before we wrap up, maybe we could mention some habit or some kind of a strategy that was a big game changer for us, or at least helped us to be more productive and just have a better work output or success output in our lives. So maybe you can start, just mention a strategy that helped you a lot, and then I'll follow up.
Well, for me, it was definitely taking a cold, or not freezing cold, but just a cold shower after lunchtime. That like literally changed my whole my whole moods. Like my energy levels are just easily like completely reset, and I can focus again. And it's almost like a lifesaver. I would say it's way better than caffeine, way better than everything I've ever tried before. So definitely super underrated, I think.
Yeah, that's a good one, actually.
What about you?
Yeah, for me, there were actually a couple of big ones in the past year or so. But one really big one for me is keeping my environment clean. And this is actually something that I'm not doing at the moment, and I should definitely get back to it. But when I did it, it just had such a almost magical impact on my overall mood, productivity, just organization mentally, not just in terms of work output, but just in terms of how big of a tendency I had to fall into more depressive, negative thoughts and the like. Just looking at your room or living room or kitchen in a very clean, organized state each and every day, when you wake up and you walk into the kitchen to make your morning coffee and everything is nice and organized. That is, for one, it's just nicer to exist in an environment to begin with. But anytime you look at it, it just reminds you that, like, okay, this is me. This is me who created this clean environment. And, as woo-woo as it sounds, but I think in the morning when I walk into the kitchen and it looks like a war zone, it's very kind of discouraging. I look at it and it's like, yeah, this reflects me. This is me who created this mess here. So for me, that was a really big one.
Yeah. That's why they do it in the military, right? You have to always clean, like always be disciplined, like reinforce this disciplined behavior. Yeah. It definitely makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So if we want to conclude this episode or kind of summarize the biggest takeaways or the kind of mini mantras that we want people to keep in mind after this episode, what would you say those points would be for them? Go ahead, Thomas.
One of the biggest messages I would say is don't always believe in your thinking or how you think about the world. Your thinking can be very biased by a lot of things, which are largely out of your, or not under your control, like personality, tendencies and stuff. So try to get like more self-awareness, try to, like as we talked, journal stuff, like try to get organized, try to write things down, try to almost view yourself like more objectively so that you can better assess where you need change and are not as caught up as you often are in the moment, so that you actually can create a life that you want to live.
Very cool. That was a great summary. Thomas, if people want to find you on the internet, check out your work, resources, and just things that you will be up to in the near future, where should they go?
Currently, I'm doing coaching. I'm doing online coaching, and I'm trying to put out some content on my blog over at campidellcoaching.com. And there is more stuff coming soon. I just bought new camera gear. So I'll be posting stuff on Instagram. You can follow me there at Campidell Coaching. And for anybody interested in what I specifically do with coaching and psychology, just shoot me a message. I'm always happy to hear you guys out and meet new people.
Awesome. Thomas, it was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you, man. That was my pleasure.
Hey guys, I just want to tell you again that your inputs for this podcast will help it grow more than anything, and your requests, ideas, and comments will contribute to awesome content going live on this channel and podcast more than anything. So if you want to contribute, the best thing you can do is to go on Facebook and look up Sustainable Self-Development. You'll find both the page and the Facebook group that is dedicated to discussions and ideas being thrown around. Go there and note down your comments about what kinds of topics or guests you want to be featured on this podcast and YouTube channel in the future. Just keep in mind the general theme of this podcast and my YouTube channel, which is to help people becoming their best selves in terms of lifestyle as it pertains to fitness and general personal development. This podcast is really dedicated to self-improvement, both physically and mentally. So keep that in mind. So thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time.